Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Becca Wasser, and I'm a fellow in the Defense Program and co-lead of the Gaming Lab here at CNAS. Welcome to this session of a Center for New American Security's annual conference. Today, we are going to be talking about a fictional conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan in 2027. I'm going to be your host for this session, sharing moderating duties with none other than the esteemed Chuck Todd, host of NBC's Meet the Press.
Hi there. Thanks, Becca. This has been a great partnership, and I'll just tell you my focus. The whole reason for this was, we like to use our Sunday show to educate the public, and I think there's a lot of knowledge about how war in Europe works, not as much knowledge about how war in Asia might work, and that's why we did what we did with you guys. Becca?
I mean, couldn't have said it better myself. So today we're going to be talking about the Wargame collaboration that CNAS and Meet the Press did, and a lot of that is centered around a potential conflict over Taiwan. And this has been a hot topic of conversation lately. China views Taiwan as a breakaway province and has long sought to eventually unify with Taiwan. Beijing has retained the overt use of military force as a means to potentially subjugate and forcibly unify with Taiwan. The United States remains deeply concerned about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and the U.S. Department of Defense has identified this as its pacing scenario, which is really the most important potential future conflict that the department plans against. But even with that, there's an open question as to whether the United States would defend Taiwan if China were to invade due to the U.S. approach of strategic ambiguity. But recently, there seem to be some signs that this might be changing. President Biden recently stated that he would commit military resources to Taiwan if China were to attack. And while this does not officially end strategic ambiguity, it is an overt signal of what the United States might do. For its part, China has embarked on a significant military modernization effort, which is largely aimed at strengthening its ability to launch a cross-strait attack and successfully invade Taiwan. This modernization effort is really beginning to bear fruit, and China may soon find itself at a point of near parity with the U.S. military, which would give it greater odds of success in a military conflict. So when you take these developments all together, along with the potential lessons learned that Beijing might be seeing based on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, altogether, these may suggest that China may decide that it needs to unify with Taiwan sooner rather than later, and China may choose to do so by military means. So there's the big question of, is there a way that the United States could keep China from invading Taiwan and prevent war? Or if China were to invade Taiwan and the United States decided to come to Taiwan's aid, how would such a conflict unfold? And so these are two of the top questions that we looked at in our recent war game that CNAS Gaming Lab ran in conjunction with NBC's Meet the Press that Chuck mentioned and is part of our broader collaboration. And so this was an operational strategic war game which examined a future conflict between China and the United States over Taiwan. And how this conflict unfolded in the war game was incredibly insightful and really interesting. It helped us identify a few different ways in which the United States, along with its most capable allies and partners, could take steps today to try and deter China from invading Taiwan. But even with that, there were some surprises throughout the game in how such a conflict unfolded, particularly when it came down to the choices and the decisions that the red team representing China and the blue team representing the United States chose to undertake. And we're going to talk about those choices and courses of action today. The blue and the red teams were made up of participants who were sitting members of Congress, former civilian and military officials, and U.S. subject matter experts on Chinese defense strategy and military capability. And we are super lucky that today we have a lot of these smart folks with us for this session. And they're going to talk about the key decisions they made and why. So representing the red team, we have Dr. Bonnie Lin, who is the director of the China Power Project and senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We also have Dr. Joel Wuthnow, who is a senior research fellow at National Defense University. For the blue team, we have Representative Mikey Sherrill, who is a congresswoman from my home state of New Jersey, as well as retired U.S. Air Force General Mike Mobile Holmes. And last but not least, we have our very own Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn, Director of the Defense Program and Senior Fellow at CNAS, and she's going to be representing the White Cell, which was the CNAS team that ran and adjudicated this war game. But before we get started, we've got a really interesting panel today in store for you. And because this is the CNAS annual conference and we go all out for that, this isn't just a regular panel. There is a twist. Today's panel is going to be interactive. So that means that you, the audience, you get to decide what you would have done if you had played in this war game. The way this is going to work is we're going to show you some clips from the war game since it was filmed live and we have those at our disposal. These clips really highlight some of the key team deliberations around the most important choices that we think they made in the game. And so you're going to see some of these deliberations and major decision points, and then we're going to end with the actions that this team's decided to take in the war game. We're then going to ask you what you would have done. And we're going to do that by first pulling up a poll where you get to sort of say whether you would take the same course of action or not. And if you decide that you would not have taken that course of action, we want to hear your alternative course of action. And you can do that by telling us what you would have done instead in the chat box. We're then going to talk to our wargame participants about why they made the decisions they did. We're also going to ask them about your alternate decisions and your alternate options that you came up. And that way, maybe in hindsight, they're actually going to determine that your strategic and operational choices would have been better options to take than what they actually ended up doing. The session is going to end with a short hot wash discussion like we do at the end of almost every single war game that we run. And so this discussion is going to focus on the key takeaways, the lessons learned from the war game, but you're also going to have the opportunity to participate in that. We want to hear your takeaways and your insights, but we also want to hear your questions. So again, using the chat box, you can post some questions for our panelists. And I know that you're itching to get started, but just bear with me for one more moment so I can tell you a few things that you need to do in order to participate. In order to join the conversation and submit questions, you need to be either at our official conference website, which is conference.cnas.org, or by joining us at cnas.org/live. The chat box is located under the video. You're also going to see the live polls pop up on screen here, and that's where you can vote, and that's going to allow you to further engage in the conversation. For some of the inputs into the chat box, I do want to note that we're not going to be accepting any anonymous comments or questions, so please take a moment to provide your name so we can incorporate your input live and that we're talking about the smart things that you came up with. Lastly, we are going to be monitoring Twitter for comments and questions. So you can follow us at CNASDC or tweet at us by using the hashtag CNAS2022. So without further ado, let's get started. Over to you, Chuck.
It is 2027, and the crisis between Taiwan and China is brewing. Taiwan's independence has become a hot topic inside their legislature. It's led a huge political uproar, sparked China's ire. Threatened by these discussions, China has demanded immediate unification talks. Taiwanese government obviously rejected. Taiwan promised not to move towards independence, but the assurances did little. So in response, China started to undertake significant military buildup in the coastal areas closest to Taiwan. They mobilized their military forces. So at this point, according to U.S. intelligence, China is posed to invade Taiwan. And this is where the war game begins. The blue team had to decide what it could still do to deter China from actually invading Taiwan. Could it reposition forces to alter the military balance in the region, issue a deterrent threat to get China to back down, get additional allies and partners on board in a broad show of strength? For the red team, they had to decide how, they already made the decision they're doing this. They had to decide how they wanted to invade Taiwan, and one of their goals was to keep the U.S. out of the fight. So the red team had to decide to launch an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, but they also chose an interesting course of action when it came to an attempt to deter the United States from getting involved. So there's your scenarios. Let's watch what happened with move one.
Keep them out of the fight while we move on Taiwan.
I would support an early knockout punch against Guam.
From our point of view, a failed invasion of Taiwan is worse than the risk of conflict with the United States. We think that the United States is already going to intervene, and so we have to do a knockout punch before they can neutralize us.
Is the assumption that your assault on Guam is going to make the United States pull back?
We think it's going to make them militarily less effective. And so even if they desire to intervene, they won't have as much capacity to intervene on behalf of Taiwan.
I think we start very forcefully with a missile bombardment on Taiwan.
You hit them in the port before they get out, because otherwise we know exactly where they're going, which is toward Taiwan to start shooting at us.
By hitting them in the ports, you are guaranteeing that Japan is going to intervene. Not sure that we can.
Would you rather take the American military stationed in Japan out to the greatest degree possible and have Japan enter the conflict, or let it steamboard Taipei, attack us, and have Japan maybe stay out of the conflict? Those are the two options.
You're going to attack Japan?
We are going to attack U.S. facilities on Japan, so U.S. air bases and U.S. ports that the U.S. uses in Japan. We are not yet going after Japanese air bases.
Okay, so what you have just seen is that the red team decided that it needed to launch a preemptive attack against the United States. And this was not only to prevent the U.S. from joining the fight, but also to degrade their offensive capability if they did decide to join the fight. So the red team decided to launch air and missile strikes on U.S. bases in Guam, the Northern Marianas, and throughout Japan. And so this is where we turn to you, the audience. If you were Chinese military planners, would you have decided to preemptively strike U.S. bases at the beginning of the conflict? And so you're going to see a poll that's coming up, and we want to hear from you. So please vote. Let us know if you agree with the red team's course of action. And if you happen to disagree, we want to hear what you would have done instead. Would you have decided not to preemptively strike U.S. bases in Japan and instead still focused on Guam or the Northern Marianas? Would you have done something entirely different? Or would you have maybe just focused solely on the invasion of Taiwan? So please type up your course of action, add it into the chat box. We want to see that moving. We want to see things churning. So we're going to leave the poll up for a few more seconds before we move to the poll results. Okay. Whew. All right. We are seeing, I think, a pretty interesting split. So we have 73% of folks saying no. They would not have decided to preemptively attack U.S. bases at the beginning of the conflict. That's interesting. So already things are getting a little bit sporty, and we happen to have our audience disagreeing. So I would like to hear a little bit more about, what some of the alternate courses of action would be. But before we do that, let's turn to Chuck, who's going to have a conversation with Bonnie and Joel, who are two members of our red team. and Stacy, who led the game, and they're going to dive into why they made these choices, what the repercussions were, but Chuck's also going to ask them about some of your alternate ideas.
So Joel, look, it's a similar question I remember asking you at the time, which was, explain why the knockout punch right out of the gate rather than the sort of what Russia did with Ukraine, which is get right up to the doorstep first and then progress. Explain.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. And it is interesting to see the poll results. I think, look, ideally, we don't want to fight the United States. We want to deter them. We want to kind of keep them out by threatening punishment, but by not actually going to war with them because it's extremely costly. I think we as a team decided that by 2027, it's so likely that the U.S. is going to support Taiwan that they're not deterrable. So that the U.S. will intervene to protect Taiwan. As Becca said up front, President Biden has said so on multiple occasions. They're getting into this, whether we like it or not. And so the idea militarily is that we have to keep them out. We have to find some way to knock out their military capacity before they can generate sorties and before they can get their fleet into position. Because if they do, then we have no chance of landing forces. We can't get across the Taiwan Strait if we are being bombarded by U.S. Tomahawk missiles and air-launched cruise missiles and you name it. We have no chance. And so we have to gamble that, we're going to knock them out and therefore deprive them of the ability to generate those sorties and launch those strikes against us. The real dilemma here, I think, for us was whether or not to attack U.S. bases in Japan and other allied countries. And I think that's where we got a lot of criticism. But the fact of the matter is that U.S. combat forces and capacity in the region is all on allied territory. Guam is very far away. And so our decision is, do we try to knock out as much U.S. capacity in Japan? We also managed somehow to bring in the Philippines and Australia. And so this is not good for us, but even worse for us, I think, is allowing all of that stuff to survive the initial 24 or 48 hours of the campaign and therefore be used against us. And so we entered into a high stakes operation that we thought was necessary ultimately to protect our forces. Over.
Bonnie, you initially were more focused on the invasion first rather than the preemptive attack. What was your rationale for that precedent? I think you're muted. Hang on.
Oh, sorry about that.
No worries.
Thank you. So thank you, Chuck. I would say that all of us on the red team were focused on the evasion. What Joel described, the difference in terms of whether we want to preemptively strike the United States or not, was still as we are engaging in our evasion. Those who believe that we should have struck first believe that it was better, as Joel mentioned, to delay U.S. intervention. But the purpose of delaying U.S. intervention was to enable us to facilitate a quick or rapid invasion. So my initial thinking was that it wasn't necessarily guaranteed for sure that the United States would intervene, but through our discussion, and if we project out to 2027, I think it's very, very likely that the United States would intervene. So eventually, I believe the entire team coalesced around the idea that we probably should move first against the United States instead of waiting. The other factor that I would say that was a scenario construct that encouraged us to think about preemptive strike was that we were under the assumption that we did not actually have much time to unify with Taiwan. We had, because of that, because of the requirement to unify fast, we had to invade. We didn't have other military options, for example, like a blockade. If we had more time, our team could have considered other military options beyond just the invasion.
Joel, I think, look, it's almost, as you saw, it's a big 3-1, saying essentially don't be the aggressor in the U.S. Explain the concern you would have had, because the goal was to decapitate the Taiwanese government. Wouldn't you have had a better shot at decapitating the Taiwanese government, basically focusing on that first and making even if the U.S. is inevitably going to come in, making them reactive?
Well, I think as Bonnie said, our time scale here was so compressed that we thought we only maybe got one chance at this. So we weren't willing to take a lot of risk in terms of, when and how the U.S. Would intervene. I think by 2027, they have the ability, I think, if they want to get into this quite quickly. Yes, I think you're right that our main objective in the campaign was to try to take out the Taiwan leadership, but we couldn't afford to, I think, do that first, see whether or not that's going to work, and then wait for the U.S. to make a decision. Because if the Taiwan leadership survived, which they did, then we're not going to only face Taiwan, we're going to face Taiwan plus a massive armada that's immediately there, and therefore we will have no chance of achieving our military objectives. And so I think, again, time is such of the essence that we kind of had to do everything in one shot.
All right, Stacey, before we have you let folks know what actually, how you adjudicated the move, what would have your adjudication have been had China not struck U.S. bases first, but essentially did what pretty much everybody in this chat's advocating, which is invade Taiwan first, try to take out the leadership first, and essentially wait for the U.S. to then react?
So this is interesting. The restraint strategy, which is what the audience seems to favor and has advocated for, would have resulted in a less good outcome for the red team because the United States forces would be unmolested and they could intervene forcefully and bring all of their combat power to bear. Most of the U.S. forces that are in the Indo-Pacific region are short-range aircraft that are based in Japan, or in our scenario in the Philippines, and also on Guam and the Northern Marianas. And if they were not actually under attack and able to intervene, that is a lot of additional combat power that American forces could have brought to bear to defend the Taiwanese. And it would have made the Chinese amphibious assault and air assault much more difficult, because the key to that succeeding was actually having air superiority. And if we could have pushed in those stealth aircraft, those fighters, to contest the airspace, they're superior aircraft to the Chinese one, we have better pilots, that would have dramatically changed the outcome. It didn't really affect China's ability to go after Taiwan itself, because a lot of the capabilities that it had for that it used, and those aren't the same missiles that it used to try to strike the United States. So a restrained strategy would have resulted in likely significantly different outcome, and I suspect that Chinese forces would not have made it ashore, or if there had been a lodgment, it would have been a much, much smaller one that was hanging on for dear life.
So essentially, the Chinese are thinking about a much longer game here, thinking how long this is going to take. It's inevitable, essentially what Joel's been arguing too. So, all right. So what did result? Where do things stand after move one, Stacey?
So in the game that we played, the Chinese team did choose to attack American bases, which degraded their ability to intervene and meant that they were able to capture the islands near the Chinese mainland that Taiwan controls, and then launch their amphibious assault, drop airborne troops onto Taiwan, and end up making it ashore and begin to invade the island. In response to that, however, because the red team attacked the United States and attacked U.S. territory, Guam in particular, the U.S. team was authorized to launch attacks at the Chinese ships that were carrying their troops to invade Taiwan in their port. So that hit the Chinese mainland and led to a different dynamic that we'll talk about next.
And also Japan got brought into the conflict because the attacks hit, they were supposed to only hit U.S. forces, right, but they hit Japanese forces too. Right?
Yes, and Japanese territory, because U.S. bases are on sovereign Japanese territory. Absolutely.
So that's where we stand there. Thank you, Stacey. So we had the initial wave of attacks. Blue team now, this is for move 2. We're setting up what to do next. Blue team is faced with some important decisions. They assessed that China had crossed the line by attacking U.S. territory, Guam, but were benefited by the addition of 2 capable allies being drawn into this fight, Japan and Australia. But they had to come up with a course of action to try to roll back the invasion of Taiwan by China. So let's see what the blue team decided to do as a result of move 1 with their second move.
Gloves are off, if you will. I mean, by attacking U.S. territory of Guam, killing Americans, the Chinese have crossed the line. I think they've also miscalculated already that they took some actions against U.S. forces in Japan that they thought would maybe prevent Japan from coming in. It actually drew Japan in. Same with Australia. How do we prevent the Chinese force that's trying to get across the Strait of Taiwan to actually be able to successfully land and start taking Taiwanese territory?
Now this is just a matter of getting as many things into the fight as we can, as quickly as possible. Getting the Australians involved in a blockade and checking out what's in the strait with the Marine Littoral Regiment subs, relying on our allies to watch the rear and maintain supply lines and maybe implement a blockade while we're fighting in the strait, in and around the Straits of Taiwan.
All right, so what you've seen is that the blue team decided to focus their efforts on picking off Red's forces that were heading toward Taiwan, and they were largely using submarines and other undersea capabilities. And the aim really was trying to attrit the invasion force, to weaken it, to reduce the amount of forces that could get ashore in Taiwan. So if you were U.S. military planners at the Pentagon or at Indo-Pacific Command, is this the course of action that you would have taken? And is this what you would have decided to do, especially after U.S. territory had just been attacked? So the poll should be coming up, and we want to hear from you if this was the course of action you would have taken. But again, if you decide against it, if you think that you've got a better idea of what should have been done, we want to hear that. Please, write in the chat box what it is that you would have done instead. And you never know, we may ask our blue team members about your alternative approach. So we're going to keep the poll up for just a little bit longer. So please keep on telling us whether you would have done what the blue team did or whether you would have done something perhaps a little bit more outside the box, or maybe you would have done nothing at all. That's also an option, but we very much want to hear from you what it is you would have done. So, please keep chatting away, and we're just going to wait. And here are the poll results. Okay. So 81% of you said yes. This is the course of action that you would have taken. Ooh, okay, so a little bit different from your reaction to the red team move. And I very much want to hear from the blue team representatives what they think about this. So Chuck, do you want to engage them in some conversation?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with you, Congresswoman Cheryl. Look, it seems as if the reactionary decision-making process seemed pretty easy because American territory had been attacked. It was unprecedented. So in some ways, that part of it was easier. But discuss some of the things you stopped short of doing, or maybe you contemplated but didn't hear, and why you chose this course of action.
Well, certainly, I think from the start, we wanted China to reconsider its decision to invade Taiwan, to think that it really was going to be too costly, that it wasn't going to work out well for them. So we wanted to impose heavy cost on their forces, while at the same time not escalate, not move into China proper and draw in all of the forces throughout the country and focus all of their efforts on this. So we were hoping to impose cost, keep this out of the range of a nuclear conflict, because of course we have concerns that China looks at its nuclear arsenal as less of a deterrent force and more of a possibility for use against, especially if we crossed possibly a line by going into their territorial, into the territory of China. So we wanted to de-escalate and impose cost on China to really attempt to get them to reconsider this invasion.
And Mike, look, you are the biggest proponent of air power. Some might say that's obvious considering your experience. What did you, the purpose was to stop the invasion. Why was this best course of action in your mind?
Well, Chuck, tactically, China's invested in several things to try to keep us at arm's length. The long-range missiles that they fired against Guam and Japan early and then some very good defenses that are mostly located on their ships, the defenses against air attacks. So we wanted to focus on trying to take out those ships early so that we could come in with more air power, which is airplanes, but also cruise missiles launched from the Navy and the whole regime that we bring in. So the things that were most important were submarines, going after those surface ships to try to gain some ability to operate in the air. China needed to control the air and the surface of the Taiwan Straits to get the invasion force across, and then also to reinforce it and keep it supplied. And we wanted to stop that. So we went after their ships with submarines and with air assets, and we're trying to set the stage for bringing in more conventional assets later to try to fight on that beachhead and on the battlefield. But we felt like we needed to degrade their defenses first.
Congresswoman, one of the alternative courses of action being suggested here, U.S. should also attack Chinese ports and air defenses on a broader scale while also moving to land U.S. forces on Taiwan to buttress their defenses. Thoughts about that?
Well, I think what we were always concerned about was escalation. So, you know, really moving in many cases to de-escalate. We did look at the different Chinese ports and their assets to make sure that we were, you know, imposing severe cost on China. Something that we did not discuss as, you know, in each and every move, though, was something that many people don't, I think, associate with our power all the time, and that is the diplomatic power that we have. So certainly at this point, China has attacked U.S. territory in Guam, and really our reaction, I think, right at this point still has the approval, I would say, of the world community in responding appropriately. And at this time, we would, of course, be gathering our diplomatic efforts to support us against China.
By the way, one of the other, and we'll address this later, but the Philippines ended up being very helpful, Congresswoman Cheryl, but that is not a given in real life here. Fair enough?
Well, I think, you know, I was looking at the comments in the chat, and I have to say, we totally came up against this exact problem. One of the comments from Joseph Medina was that the U.S. doesn't have multilateral security agreements with many of our allies and partners. And that really was something that I think was brought to our attention time and again as we maneuvered here, which is contrary, of course, to how we operate in the European theater.
So, Stacey, before we get to the real adjudication here, let's say the U.S. response had been more aggressive and had been more as one of the courses, as Charles Berry suggested, hit more Chinese ports, make this a broader, essentially broaden things out. What would that have done?
Yeah, there are a lot of military and operational reasons to want to strike targets on the Chinese mainland, including expanding the attacks on ports, because it's easier to find ships when they're docked than when they are moving and transiting across water, especially when the waters are cluttered with a bunch of commercial ships, to make discriminating and identifying the military ships difficult. Also, China's ability to launch long-range missiles that range Japan or Guam or the Philippines or even Australia depends on some capabilities that are on their mainland. So they have different intelligence collection and headquarters that are necessary for them to be able to accurately launch these long-range attacks. And if those were destroyed or degraded, it would be much more difficult for them to actually execute the operation successfully, to make adjustments and give their forces different orders. So if they were to do that, it would have potentially made the invasion force stumble a little bit more and encounter more problems. They probably still would have made it ashore at this point because they had launched and there were enough forces that were moving in that direction that they were already underway. But sustaining those forces and actually turning this into a decisive victory would have been very challenging.
Well, it's interesting to hear. It's interesting to see these suggestions because it's like, some folks are clearly anticipating escalation, and it's sort of like, okay, we're going to escalate. It's just all about when do we escalate. But anyway, with that, Stacey, where did we land after move 2, given what the blue team's response was?
So move 2, there was a lot that happened. The Chinese invasion force made it ashore. A number of ships were attrited. A lot of their destroyers that provided air defense were taken out by American submarines at either end of the strait and by long-range missiles that were fired from bombers at range. And that actually did degrade China's ability to reach the shore, but they were still able to get through. We didn't have enough missiles. There's only so many shots that each submarine can fire before they have to go back and reload and go to a port. So China also had already decided to escalate in response to the initial attacks that the blue team made on the ships in port, which were seen as being very calibrated and limited. They weren't going after mainland targets deep on Chinese territory. They were just trying to hit the ships, the military ships in port that were carrying the invasion force. The red team didn't view it that way. And because of those strikes and the fact that Japan, the Philippines, and Australia allowed U.S. forces to operate from their territory, and in the case of Japan and Australia joined the fight, the red team launched attacks against all of them. And so air bases, naval bases, headquarters were all under attack. For the escalation and the strikes against the Chinese mainland, the red team decided that they needed to go further. Guam is a U.S. territory, not a U.S. state. And so they launched some cruise missile strikes at U.S. base in Hawaii, the headquarters there that would have been directing the air war.
And in response, we took out China's headquarters too. Their Pacific Command as well, right? As a sort of escalatory response.
There was a tit for tat there.
Right. Okay. So there we are. They've attacked the U.S. state. And that puts us with the incremental gains of the invasion of Taiwan. We have the China team now to consider what was the most pivotal and perhaps shocking course of action and how they responded now after move 2, after everything that you've seen what happened. So anyway, prepare for this one. Let's take a look at move 3.
I wonder if we could do a hemp shot not over, but near where the most of the U.S. forces are, because that would be clear signaling to them that we are serious about using nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. But obviously, we wouldn't want it right over in this area at this point.
So you're saying a demonstration explosion?
Yeah, at higher altitude.
And is this a bluff, or are we really willing to use nuclear weapons?
I think that depends on folks in the room, but I think in a no-kidding Taiwan scenario, if we are really facing the prospect of defeat, we should be willing to use nuclear weapons. It might not be nuclear weapons on Taiwan. It could be a tactical nuke against invading U.S. or intervening U.S. forces.
Well, I'm not going to lie, but that was the moment in the game. So what you've seen here is that the red team decided to launch a nuclear demonstration off the coast of Hawaii. So let me just explain a little bit what that was. So it was a high altitude nuclear explosion, a hemp shot, as Bonnie mentioned in the clip, and it resulted in an electromagnetic pulse. It was done far enough away from populated areas of Hawaii that it was designed to not directly impact Hawaii itself. And this in part was because it was intended as a strategic signal to get the United States to back down and not continue to be involved in the fight as it had been. But whether it was a signal or whatnot, or just a nuclear demonstration, it's worth noting how significant this was. Let's say that this were to occur in real life, it would have been the first use of a nuclear weapon since World War II. Let that sink in for a little bit. The first use of a nuclear weapon since World War II. So if you were Chinese military planners, or even if you happen to be the Chinese president, would you have decided to use or authorize the use of a nuclear weapon? And this could be a nuclear weapon even in a demonstration rather than a direct attack. So we've got the poll pulled up. Please vote and let us know if you agree with the course of action that the red team took. Do you think that using a nuclear weapon in any form, and in this case in a nuclear demonstration, was the right choice for the China team to take at this stage in the game and with the level of escalation that we've seen. And if you disagree and you think that perhaps maybe using a nuclear weapon in a demonstration was a bridge too far and that there were other means of signaling, we want to hear what actions you would have taken, what other ways of signaling you would have tried to convey your really important message to the United States to take a step back from this conflict and that it wasn't their fight. So we're going to keep the poll up for a little bit. And oh, nope, actually the results just came in. So we've got a lot of folks that seem to disagree with what the red team did. So 76% of participants said no, they would not have used or authorized the use of a nuclear weapon at this stage in the conflict. Well, I want to hear a lot more about that. So Chuck, perhaps maybe you and Bonnie can talk about that a bit more.
All right, let's start with that. And Bonnie, I don't want to presume the why on this sort of 3-1 on this. I could, sort of obviously, I think there's two sort of, to be black and white about this, two potential reactions, the assumption being, hey, we test this and the world pressures the United States to back off. Hey, we don't want this. Taiwan isn't worth a nuclear war, right? That somehow that maybe that's what is created, this pressure on the United States to back off, versus what I think everybody on this poll is thinking, all you're doing is making it easier for the U.S. to get involved and making public opinion, that is that mindset. But explain your rationale, Bonnie. This was your thought process, and obviously meaning why you think the Chinese military planners would have done this.
Sure. Thank you, Chuck. And I would note that we actually discussed using nuclear weapons not only in Move 3, but it was brought up in Move 1 and brought up in Move 2, and only as a team did we agree to use nuclear weapons through the demonstration shot in Move 3. So part of our rationale for this was not so much that we wanted to use nuclear weapons for warfighting purposes. It was exactly like what Becca said. We want to use nuclear weapons in order to politically signal to the United States. And as Becca and as the discussion outlined, we did not use nuclear weapons over U.S. military targets. We didn't use it over civilian centers. So this shot was mainly intended to signal to the U.S. public in particular, but also U.S. political leadership, that if you continue sending significant troops and continue the fight with respect to Taiwan, China would be keen to use all military options against the United States, including the prospect of potentially using nuclear weapons. And this wasn't just a signal to the United States. We were also trying to signal to U.S. allies and partners that are critical to supporting the U.S. fight. So this includes signaling to Japan, to the Philippines, and other allies and partners that if this fight was continuing to drag on, that, hey, your targets may be next. And if other countries, for example, Australia, other U.S. partners wanted to join in, they were also potentially targets from the Chinese military side.
And Joel, what were some of the other options? I know a serious discussion about hitting Coronado on the continental United States was discussed at that point. So what were some of the alternative courses besides that nuclear test?
Well, we could have gone conventional against U.S. West Coast targets, but I think, the problem there is that militarily our ability to do that is very, very limited. Even in 2027, we have long-range missiles, but we don't have long-range missiles with endless ranges and endless numbers. And so we were trying to think, what do we have, I think, that can send the signal? I think, realistically, other alternatives at this point in the game that we might have considered would have been escalating into either cyberspace and doing some sort of attack on U.S. Critical infrastructure, perhaps to create a domestic emergency in the United States that would absorb Washington's attention. Or we may have escalated into space, for instance, to go after U.S. communication satellites and so on in order to, again, create dysfunction or disarray in the mainland of the U.S. But the nuclear signaling, I think, almost paradoxically was somewhat less escalatory because it didn't create any real damage. It was just sort of a signal to say, look, if you're really going to commit to these mainland strikes, we will take off our gloves as well. And so there were some other options, but I think at this point, facing a military balance that was sort of trending against us, this was one of the better ways we could come up with to try to change the U.S. calculus.
We're not getting a lot of alternative courses of action here, of suggestions on that front. Is Stacy still with us? I know that she was a time crunch. Yeah, Stacy, very quickly, one alternative course of action that's been suggested, sticking with a conventional strike on, say, U.S. bases. The suggestion is South Korea, but hitting more U.S. bases on a conventional instead of doing the nuclear test. Would that have done anything that didn't, well, essentially the game ended after this for our own purposes, but what would that have done?
I'm not sure that would have achieved the desired objective. Like the other countries that were targeted, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, it sort of solidified their support for Taiwan and the United States in this scenario. And you can imagine that South Korea, which we had posited stayed out and was not intervening in either way, providing active support to either side. And U.S. forces that are based in South Korea were not contributing to the military operations in defense of Taiwan, that might have changed the calculus. And the South Korean military is quite capable. So it could have, escalated it further and brought more states in on the side of the defense of Taiwan. In general, both of the countries at this point, the war had stalemated. China got its forces ashore, but it had to figure out how to sustain them. And both the U.S. and the Chinese team had used a lot of their high-end long-range munitions and missiles. And so they were facing this prospect of a long, grinding fight either way. And so the idea that they would threaten further violence to get the United States to back down seemed like a way of potentially shortening the war and producing a victory more quickly.
All right, so let's try to get a preview of what a move forward by the United States would have been if we can bring in Mike back and we can bring in Congresswoman Cheryl. So, Mike, I think the Chinese think the nuclear test would create diplomatic pressure in the United States to back off. What say you?
Well, it certainly might, and it's a tough decision now for the national command authorities of the U.S. and our partners here. But if they decide to continue to fight, my advice would be that this is an opportunity to use the diplomatic and informational tools that Congressman Cheryl talked about. The outcome is in doubt. China's lost a lot of ships and airplanes. It looks like a sign that they're not sure they can win this war conventionally. And so I think our message would be around the world to counter this nuclear weapon as an information warfare tool, which is hard to imagine, would be, hey, this is what happens if China doesn't get their way, is that they're a bully, they're not as strong as they thought they were, and they're going to try to escalate this. All of us around the world will eventually face this challenge from China. And is it better now to band together around the world and to stop China from achieving their goals, or to fight them later when they're stronger or when we back down?
Congresswoman, I don't want you to try to predict what the political fallout would be, but I have to say it's pretty obvious that we know that there's an isolationist streak in this country. A nuclear test like that, I don't think it's a given that all of a sudden it's a rally around the flag. Let's go get China. What do you think is the political response of that Congress?
What kept occurring to me, Chuck, throughout this tabletop exercise was how quickly things kept escalating, despite our best efforts to de-escalate, to create costs, to attempt to move China away from this invasion. And yet, it kept escalating the situation. And certainly the nuclear attack was completely surprising, I think, to the blue team that China would go to this effort. We talk a lot about China's use of nukes. And what occurred to me is that we have tried for years to get China to the table to discuss use of nuclear weapons, to discuss, much as we would do during the Cold War with Russia. And I do think certainly there are a great deal of concerns with Russia and nuclear weapons, but we have talked to Russia for years and years, decades, about use of nukes and when, what the parameters were. And I think we have a better sense there of what Russia might calculate, how they might make those calculations. We're never sure, and we're always very careful. With China, I think what's really necessary is that we do get to the table with China and understand this better, because here is a country that's growing their nuclear arsenal at a very quick clip, that has tactical nukes, which concern us, of course, because that speaks to using nuclear weapons in a way that we would certainly never want to see. And I think it's really more important after this exercise than ever, after we see this, that we get China to the table. That said, I have I actually thought this was a bad move on the part of the red team. I have an incredibly difficult time, even with the isolationist tendencies of the United States, having it be acceptable in any way that a nuclear weapon was exploded right off our shores. It's just so unprecedented. It's such a different understanding in the United States, even though there's probably a theoretical understanding of how the ranges of weapons now are so much longer than they were in the past. Just to have a sense, just that type of insecurity from the United States. We can talk a lot about what the short-term reaction would be. I certainly think the long-term reaction against that would really be very bad for China.
All right. Well, Becca, I think I throw it back to you.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here. And I think we are transitioning from the fun, super interactive part to our hot wash discussion, which is a discussion where we talk about what we've learned from the war game, some of the insights that we've gleaned. And we do this at the end of almost every single game that we play and run in. So you get to be the audience, you get to be a part of our hot wash discussion today. So we're going to try and incorporate some of your questions into the discussion. So please throw your questions into the chat. We're going to try and get through as many audience questions as possible. But, I think Chuck has a few up his sleeve to begin with. So do you want to get started?
Sure. Joel, I think that the hardest part of this war game for me was feeling as if we all have a full understanding of how the Chinese think strategically with their military. And I know that this is, I think, the hardest thing. The hardest thing I had to do was not apply Western intellect, essentially, right? A Western reaction of confirmation bias to what we assume. And so just walk us through, what is it about the Chinese military strategy that maybe runs a bit counter to sort of Western thinking that we fully don't get?
Well, and I guess to start off with, there's sort of the opposite bias, which is to say that, the Chinese are so inscrutable and their ambitions so indecipherable that we can't possibly understand them, because I think we can. I find the PLA to be quite heavily scripted, their training to be quite rote, their plans to be relatively transparent based on how they train, how they exercise, and how they think about these sorts of operations. And so, I don't think they have some sort of very, hidden or inscrutable sort of, plan that will surprise us at the moment. What's potentially different about them is that they tend to be much more centralized and hierarchical, I think, in their decision making. They tend to move in lockstep, and in a Leninist system, which is what they are, they really need to do this. I think, from the blue perspective, the Americans tend to be much more comfortable with, sending decision-making authority down to the battlefield level and empowering commanders to make difficult and innovative decisions on the battlefield. Whereas, the Chinese, they tend not to trust. They tend not to place that level of authority in their mid-level and lower, more junior level commanders. And so I think that actually makes the Chinese easier to anticipate. And it also creates something of an Achilles heel for them. And I think this is one of the things that Blue tried to do by going after Red headquarters. Once you sort of cut the head, if you will, off the red snake, then, it produces paralysis in their system, because, those lower level people stop in, they don't innovate. They don't know what to do. They're looking up and no one's telling them exactly what they need to be doing. And so I thought from a Blue perspective, that was a very effective thing that they would be doing.
Hey, Mike, the biggest takeaway for me is I keep thinking, boy, do we need Asian NATO. And, I apologize for shorthanding it. I know I'm not in this field, so I apologize if that comes across as sort of too binary here. But the bottom line was we needed more supply lines. We needed more places to essentially base not just human resources, but other resources. But I'm curious, what were your biggest takeaways from participating in this? And I know you've done a bunch of these.
Well, thanks, Chuck. And, I agree with you there that we really do need friends and partners there to be successful. And whether it's in a formal partnership like NATO, China right now is our best friend on driving people toward an enhanced partnership with us because of their actions in the theater and around the world, and we should take advantage of it. But I was struck mostly with the fact that, hey, this is not going to be a war that's won in, hours or days. We were a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks into this when we finished our Move 3. China had a foothold on Taiwan, but the issue was still in doubt. And I was left wondering, what could we have done in the years prior to the invasion between now and 2027 that would have made it that much more challenging? And if you look at the efforts we've taken on behalf of Ukraine, you can kind of ask the same question. If we had taken those efforts in 2014, would things be different? And what we're looking at there. And so my main takeaway is, what can we do now to try to prevent this from happening by making Taiwan stronger?
Well, let's go to somebody who's on the Armed Services Committee who actually can do this stuff. Congresswoman, this was, to me, one of my bigger takeaways was your takeaway when you said, boy, I'm glad that I actually got to participate in this exercise, because I think there's a lot of work to do between now and fictional 2027 here to actually be prepared for the U.S. to defend Taiwan.
Exactly. And what struck me is when I say that I think that was a real miscalculation on the red team, it's not that I think that the red team acted in a way China wouldn't. It's that I think China miscalculates sometimes how to react to the United States or what we might think. And that's why I think presenting such a strong deterrent force, presenting unity with allies in the region. And as you heard from the general, one of the best ways that we get, great relationships throughout Asia is because they stand in contravention to China, which is often a bad actor in the region that people really would like to have support against. And so I think working on those relationships, but that's kind of, I have to be honest, Chuck, that's sort of a Foreign Affairs Committee plan. What we do on the House Armed Services Committee is make sure we have the most modern force, that we can deter China, that we can make China realize that invading our friends, invading our allies, acting against the interest of the United States comes at a very, very high cost, hopefully too high of a cost for them to consider to do that.
Stacey, I know we have look, there's been a pivot to Asia for, I would argue, 3 straight administrations in some form or another. What should the Department of Defense be doing right
now? So there are actually a number of different things that the department should be doing. I agree with the Congresswoman that escalation was one of the big issues. And I think seriously considering the risks of escalation, where we are willing to take those and where we want to avoid them and how we manage it would be really important. I also agree with Mike that we need to do more to prepare. In this scenario that we constructed, we assumed that the United States and Taiwan had taken a lot of steps that are not true today. So we assumed that the United States had been buying the maximum number of long-range missiles that it could today between now and 2027. We also assumed that they'd made improvements to their posture and gained new base access in places like the Philippines, which was pointed out earlier as a potentially questionable assumption. We always know that base access is something that is determined in real time. It's a very political issue, and it depends on a country's interests, in addition to the agreements that they have with the United States, because all 3 nations that did support the U.S. coalition here are American allies. Finally, we assumed that Taiwan had sort of learned the lessons of Ukraine and made a lot of adjustments to its defense strategy and its acquisition policy by focusing on acquiring smaller, more attritable systems like drones, also improving its air defenses and having mobile air defenses, more long-range anti-ship cruise missiles, instead of focusing on large systems like ships, submarines, or aircraft, which China is likely able to easily destroy early in the conflict. So those steps that we assumed to end up in this outcome really, really need to be taken to strengthen the deterrence. The other piece, I think you're right, Chuck, is about allies and partners. And I don't think I'm particularly sanguine that the NATO for Asia is going to emerge in the near term, but we can take steps to deepen our strategic and operational planning, have discussions about this, think about what we might do in this situation so we can develop plans that are actually executable, and also practice this as a deterrence signal. And that would show China that they would likely face a coalition of states that would oppose them and defend Taiwan, and should change their calculus fairly significantly.
Bonnie, I want to deal with a form of one of the questions we have for the hot wash, which is the idea that the red team made such an overt first move. We've sort of litigated that a bit, but I guess let me reformat the question this way. What is China learning from Russia and Ukraine right now? Because in many ways, that was a huge part of your discussion. Hey, we're not going to make the mistakes that Russia did X. Now, ironically, at the time we did this war game, Russia looked to be in a lot worse shape than it is today, right? And it's a slightly different strategy Russia's embarking upon right now. But what do you imagine the Chinese military leaders are taking away right now from Russia and Ukraine?
So there are a lot of potential lessons learned that China is taking away from Ukraine. And right now, we still don't see any significant authoritative studies by the PLA published because it's still relatively early on. But based off of some of our preliminary analysis, one of the key takeaways that China has is that it wants to avoid some of the mistakes that Russia had, which was, and one of the mistakes was amassing significant troops next to Ukraine, but taking time before the actual invasion. That decreased the element of surprise and the actual Russian use of troops, and it bought the United States, NATO, and other countries time to provide Ukraine with significant weapons. So as China looks at Taiwan, one of the things it wants to maintain is to be able to maintain this element of surprise, to be able to move faster. Another lesson learned that China sees right now with Ukraine, particularly given some of the early offensives against Kyiv, is that Russia did not commit enough troops, right, and did not plan the operation very well. There's also issues with Russian training. So as China looks to Taiwan, one of the main takeaways will be, as China thinks about a rapid invasion of Taiwan, it will need to commit significant troops. This is already very much in line with what some of the assumptions China had. I don't think anywhere in the past China had assumed that it would require a small number of troops to invade Taiwan, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine likely reinforced many of these lessons. I would just note that when we think about how China uses force against Taiwan, China's timeline for when it seeks unification will matter a lot, because if China has a much longer timeline, say not months, but years, if not decades, to unify with Taiwan, it does allow for what the original question asked, more subtle ways to seek to increase Chinese influence against Taiwan. But if Xi Jinping's timeline is, say, only 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years, is only 3 years or 5 years, or even shorter than that, then that creates more incentives for China to use more escalatory means against Taiwan to achieve unification.
Joel, attempt to answer this question it's in our chat, which is how the international economic sanctions, which would have been inevitable against China, how that would have, we didn't. Let's be frank here. We were in a truncated timeline with our war exercise, our war game exercises here, but walk us through what you think would have been the impact of the economic sanctions that you would assume would have been fairly brutal, at least I would think, at least with the Western allies.
Well, and this is another sort of set of takeaways from the recent Ukraine war, which is that Russia was heavily, perhaps even beyond their expectations, sanctioned by not only the United States, but also countries that were quite economically reliant on Russia. And so China, I believe, is revising its assessments about the willingness of the U.S. and its global coalition of allies to do similar things, both in terms of financial sanctions, also trade sanctions, and so on. And so I think that China is building that assessment into its plans. They're trying to find, not only analyze the costs, but also to try to minimize those costs by accelerating the onshoring of different matters, economic matters and production matters, critical supplies, and so on. The issue of China's own strategic partners. I do believe that China will lean somewhat on Russia to backfill things that are missing from China's economy, as well as other countries, including countries like India, which was surprisingly non-committal about sanctioning Russia. I think China will look to these sorts of fence-sitting countries not to punish China in this context. And so I think China will take those steps. And so that really implies whether, the extent to which the U.S. will be able to impose sanctions at the same level as against Russia, if China is able to take these steps. And ultimately what that means is, from a deterrence point of view, can China really be deterred by the threat of punishment if it's already included that into its plans? And so I think the situation will be much more difficult 5 or 7 years from now, when China is much more domestically focused and has taken all these sorts of things into consideration.
Look, Joel, answer this follow-up real quick, which is you brought up Russia, so I'll let you go ahead and deal with this follow-up. Why wasn't that the plan to sort of work with Russia preemptively?
Well, from a military perspective, I think, the Russian memory also runs deep. And what I think the Russians will remember from Ukraine is that China did next to nothing to support them militarily. They provided diplomatic cover. They, tried to do this sort of middle-of-the-road diplomatic posture, but they didn't give Russia the things that they needed, let alone actually create some sort of distraction in Asia that Russia could leverage opportunistically to improve its position in Europe. And so from that point of view, really, why would Russia return the favor? They have no favor to return. There is a broader question, though, as to whether other states that have a grievance with the United States wouldn't take this situation to behave opportunistically, whether it's North Korea, Iran, Russia, or some other state. And so I think from a U.S. planning perspective, you really have to take that set of concerns seriously. You're putting, maybe too many of your eggs into the Indo-Pacific basket. You have to worry about something heating up in some other theater with maybe not Russia, but some other country taking advantage of the situation.
Congresswoman, the news that a military base is being built in Cambodia by China. How quickly do we start looking for more allies? Whether it's Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, are there places that we want to get essentially in response to what China's doing? Is that something that U.S. ought to be pursuing, is pursuing, and you'd like to see?
Yes. Emphatically, yes. I would like to see us pursuing stronger diplomatic relationships, basing rights throughout the region. We do have strong ties with certain allies there, Japan, Australia. But, it was interesting to see that South Korea, in our estimation, remained sidelined. And when they did, our assets at that base remained sidelined. So to understand the region and what we're going to need to fight there, making sure that we have those basing agreements in place, making sure that we have the diplomatic ties in place, that we're growing stronger ties throughout the region, and then making sure that we have, as I said, when we look at what we're doing on the Armed Services Committee, making sure we have the weapons in place, long-range fires, for example. We're working on my base on a long-range cannon to just meet and overmatch the munitions that China and possibly others have to combat us. And that was so important, some of those munitions and the ability to field those. So we're working really hard, I think, to make sure that we are in the right place with our modernization of our armed forces, with our diplomacy at the right time. The one thing I hope that China's taken away from Ukraine is this idea that this is an incredibly costly enterprise to take territory by force. China has done quite well recently in sort of waiting for the opportune moments to impose its will on territories. And by that, I mean they had some success in Hong Kong under the previous administration. They've had some success due to COVID and strict sanctions on certain regions, which caused people from outside China to move out of the area like Hong Kong. We're seeing them now impose stronger measures in that area. So we've actually seen China have more success playing the long game than going into a head-to-head military conflict. And hopefully what China is learning now from Ukraine is that is simply too risky of a move and too costly of a move.
Strategically, Mike, number one, I want you to answer one of the questions that's on the Hot Watch, which is, what role can Australia play in this coalition? But my additive would be, how important strategically will it be to have India on sort of Team West here?
Well, I'll start with the India question. And, India is the world's largest democracy. India, with the tremendous resources of human capital that they bring, it's important that, India continue to grow and work alongside us. And we continue to spend time with the Indian Armed Forces and with the Indian government to try to convince them that they have a better future, making sure they keep their bonds with us than they do with keeping their bonds with China. But, India is going to hedge their bets. They have to. They're going to watch the world, and they're going to try to keep an open hand to everyone, but try to continue to grow and work with us when they can. On the second issue on Australia, Australia is a proud, tough military that we fought alongside in many conflicts. They have almost completely redesigned their Air Force in a very short amount of time and made it one of the most capable air forces in the world. They're investing in similar capabilities in their air, surface, and subsurface Navy, and the partnership announced through Australia, UK, and the U.S. offers a lot of potential to increase that. But Australia is already bearing burdens against China. Australia is already paying a price in their trade for their farm materials and their resources because China doesn't like it when they stand up and talk about the bad things that China does. So Australia offers us great opportunities in basing, but also is a great leader in the region to try to influence other partners to join.
Hey, Bonnie, I love this question that was thrown in here also. Because this has been in the back of my head. In this war game, is it more important for the red team to model what China would do or what China should do? I'm pretty confident you guys were in the would category, but explain.
Sure. Most war games I've been in, we're in the would category because we're trying to model what we think to be a realistic Chinese response in order to inform, but also help the U.S. government plan on our potential actions. It also helps the United States and our allies partners think through what we need to do together in order to counter potential Chinese responses and ways in which China should escalate. But I do think it's a really great suggestion to also model actions that maybe the Chinese leadership currently under Xi Jinping might not be willing to do, but it might be possible that future generations, the future Chinese leadership may do. And I think it's important because we can't assume that China's thinking on how it might use force will remain the same. It's possible that we could have another Chinese leader after Xi Jinping who might be more or less willing to use force. So I think it's important to have both modeled. But I do want to note, as you mentioned, that most so far of the wargaming has been modeling what China would do, not necessarily what China should do or could do.
I want to sort of go to what we're seeing on the ground, and that is sort of the waning. Look, what China might be taking away right now, as the West clearly is starting already to at least publicly look like they're growing impatient with Ukraine and with the situation there. Does the West have enough patience, and is that China's best asset?
Well, certainly engaging in a war when it's not over your sovereign territory, when it's far away, and when you're trying to explain to the American people why it's important. and why it's important to world affairs, why it's important to U.S. affairs, is something that's can sometimes be difficult to do as people at home start to feel the impacts of that war and start to question whether or not this is worth it and how long is it worth it. So, we certainly have in New Jersey, in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area, the largest Ukrainian American group of people in the country. So certainly in my district in New Jersey, we're very supportive of the Ukrainians and really want to see them successful in supporting their democracy, but it has been a hardship on people here at home. And so I think China is measuring that. China is looking right now, how long will the West bear some of these burdens? What does that look like? And what are ways to undermine that support? And so, I think supporting Ukraine in their efforts for democracy is important on several, many levels, not just for the Ukrainian people, but certainly for the promotion of democracy and democratic ideals in the future.
Mike, the importance of having the experience of fighting a war, and this Chinese military right now, knock on wood. So, I mean, Russia had Chechnya, Russia had Georgia, certainly initial fighting on the east with Ukraine. They've had Syria. The Chinese military hasn't had a lot of hot tests here. How should that factor into U.S. strategy?
Well, that's a factor. And the traditional weaknesses in kind of autocratic countries, as we talked about, have been making command and control work, pushing authority down to the lowest levels and allowing people to take initiative. And we've talked about that a little bit here today. But China is working on doing that. They're working to go into a more combined arms approach, into a more joint approach. They're working very hard on the command and control tools required to bring those forces together. And I think they'll take that lesson away from Russia's actions, that Russia did not do a good job of that, particularly early, and they'll work at it. But they'll have lessons to learn. They'll certainly have to make mistakes and get better in conflict. But look, the truth is, for the United States, the wars that we've been engaged in for the last 20 years against violent extremists in the Middle East haven't required us to deal with a lot of those problems either. And I think they'll be learning on both sides, and both sides will be searching for a way that they can command and control forces better than the other side and interfere with the other side's command and control to be more effective if war comes.
Joel, what's your sense of how the Chinese public would handle deaths in the military, this war, a bloody war with the West, especially when you think rhetorically, the Chinese want to have their public posture being, they're not an aggressor. And in this case, they'd be the aggressor. Well, how long would public sentiment hold for the Chinese leadership?
Well, I think Chinese sentiment would hold for quite a long time at a very high level of intensity. And this is really, a product of years and years of campaigning publicly. They call it patriotic education to convince the people of the rightness of their position, that Taiwan really is a part of the mainland and should be under CCP rule. So there isn't a need to fabricate a pretext. This is sort of ingrained in their mindset. I don't think they take this for granted, though. I think this is something they need to keep instilling in their public from a very young level up through the ages. We've seen recently with the COVID situation in China and a lot of discontent and dissatisfaction with CCP policies that are sort of percolating, in different places and at different levels. And so I don't think they can take it for granted. But this is a matter of national pride for them. So I think, from a U.S. perspective, saying that we're going to run the Chinese economy dry and make people sort of campaign against the leadership, I think that would be very, very difficult to do, especially in a compressed time frame. So I wouldn't bank on the public being an important center of gravity that the U.S. would be able to target effectively.
And Mikey Sherrill, let me have you answer this sort of the last question here, which is, look, our intelligence was so good with Ukraine. And I think the question is, what do we need to do to make sure we are equally as good in our intelligence of what China's up to with Taiwan as we have been and are with Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to start to sound like a broken record. We need to increase our diplomatic ties. We need to utilize the ties we already have. We need to have people on the ground. Something that I don't know if people here at home realize, since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, we've worked very hard to establish ties with the Ukrainians to make sure they were ready to fight if there was another invasion. We need to make sure that we have all those ties in the region, and we do. We have very long-standing ties with many of our allies throughout the region. We just have to make sure that we're continuing to grow those, we're continuing to support those. And again, it does feel as if we are hearing more and more of dissatisfaction with Chinese leadership. So when you're kind of the bills are coming due to some of the Belt and Road initiatives we've seen around the world as China moves in to build different roads and bridges and ports, but then extracts a great deal from the countries and bankrupting certain areas. So this feels like the time when the U.S. is really able to show a different kind of leadership in the region and a different kind of support for the priorities of so many of the countries there.
Boy, it'd been nice if we had something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Oh, never mind. I will stop. Might have been an interesting idea, creating an economic pact in Southeast Asia and all of the Pacific. Becca, back to you.
Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news and end what is a fantastic conversation and stop it short, but I think sadly this is really all we have time for today. So I want to thank Chuck and all of our panelists today for joining us and for sharing their time and their knowledge with us. And I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us, for your active participation and for your terrific insights and feedback. And so, you've seen a few clips today from the Wargame, but if you want to learn more about the CNAS Dangerous Straits Wargame, you can watch the entire episode of Meet the Press Reports, and that's available on our website, on YouTube, on NBC News Now. But before we let you go, we have one last surprise for you today. Because you joined us for this session, you get an extra special sneak peek of a new report that we are releasing next week. This report captures insight from the Dangerous Straits Wargame, and it provides recommendations for the U.S. Department of Defense, U.S. Congress, and Taiwan. So you can check the report out at the link that you probably see on your screen, or by going to cnas.org/MTP Wargame. So please give it a read. We are really interested in what you think, and we're very much looking forward to your feedback and hope it is an extra special treat because you were here with us today. So thank you again for joining us and for your active participation, and we hope to see you at future CNAS events. Take care, everyone.